A man was tailgated by a stressed out woman on a busy boulevard when suddenly the light turned yellow just in front of him. Well, he did the right thing and stopped, even though he probably could have beaten the red light by accelerating through the intersection. But the woman behind him hit the brakes and the roof and her horn, screaming in frustration as she missed her chance to make it through the intersection. While she was still in mid-rant, she heard a tap on her window and looked up into the face of a very serious-looking police officer. The officer ordered her to exit her car with her hands up. He took her to the police station where she was searched, fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a holding cell. After several hours, the policeman approached the cell and opened the door. She was escorted back to the booking desk where the arresting officer was waiting with her personal effects. The officer said, "Ma'am, I'm very sorry for this mistake. You see, I pulled up behind your car while you were blowing your horn and flipping the guy off in front of you and cussing up a blue streak. And I noticed the Choose Life license plate, the What Would Jesus Do bumper sticker, the Follow Me to Sunday School window cling, and the chrome-plated Christian fish emblem on the trunk. So naturally, I assumed you'd stolen the car." Hi, I'm Pastor Allen, and welcome to New Salem's Midweek Bible Study. The question for all of us who claim to follow Jesus is this: does our walk match our talk? Do our outward actions really reflect what's on the inside? And what does that say about us? Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, closed out his warning against performing acts of piety for the approval of others by giving instructions about something called fasting. Now, just to recap to this point, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus told his followers that their righteousness had to exceed that of the most outwardly religious people they knew, the scribes and the Pharisees. In that culture, as we've said before, the scribes were the epitome of religious knowledge. Supposedly, nobody knew the Bible better than they did. The Pharisees were the epitome of religious behavior. Supposedly, no one was more devoted to God than they were. In chapter 5, the first part of the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus offered 6 examples of ways that many of the scribes had apparently misinterpreted God's expectations. The scribes had interpreted God's commands in a way that gave the outward appearance of obedience, but missed the inner spirit of what God had really wanted. Jesus stressed that his followers' actions should be guided by a genuine love for God and a genuine love for one's neighbor. In chapter 6, the next section of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus focused on the ways that many of the Pharisees had misapplied 3 key religious practices. First of all, in Matthew 6, verses 2 through 4, Jesus talked about giving to charity. Jesus warned that religious hypocrites gave primarily to impress other people with their generosity. In contrast, when true disciples give, the only approval they're seeking is God's. Jesus moved on to talk about prayer in Matthew 6, verses 5 through 15. And Jesus warned that religious hypocrites prayed only to either draw attention to their piety or to try to manipulate God, to control him. True disciples pray to align themselves with God's will and to express their dependence on him. So that brings us to the third practice that the Pharisees were known for, the practice of fasting, which Jesus talks about in Matthew 6, verses 16 through 18. "Whenever you fast, do not put on a gloomy face as the hypocrites do, for they neglect their appearance so that they'll be noticed by men when they're fasting. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face so that your fasting will not be noticed by men, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." Now, for most people today, their only experience with fasting is probably in preparation for having blood drawn at the doctor's office, or maybe if you're getting ready for a surgical procedure. Since most of us today have very little exposure to fasting as a spiritual discipline, we're going to spend a few minutes explaining what fasting is and how it's described in the Bible. Even if you never intend to fast, what Jesus says about fasting has some important implications for all of your worship and devotion to God. So I hope you'll stick with us. Fasting is abstaining from food for a spiritual purpose. Sometimes today, people will abstain from other things besides food for a spiritual purpose. But in the Bible, fasting primarily involves staying away from food. During a fast, participants typically abstain from all food and beverages except for water and maybe a little fruit juice. Most experts say that the average person can survive 3 weeks or more without food, but only 3 or 4 days without water. Therefore, the fast described in the Bible as including both food and drink were either of a limited duration or they limited hydration to water alone as opposed to other beverages. Fasting also is usually for a set period of time. A person can fast for only one meal, or you could fast for several meals. Some people fast for longer periods, up to 40 days. Now, before planning a fast, there's a couple of things you really need to consider. First of all, you need to consider your physical capability for fasting. Some people have medical conditions that inhibit them from taking part in a fast, or maybe they take medication that needs to be taken with food. So that puts a damper on how many meals they can skip. Anyone who's considering a lengthy fast, say more than a few days, should really consult their doctor first, just to make sure there won't be any adverse effects on their health. The second thing you need to consider is your goal in undergoing a fast. Why are you fasting? What do you hope to accomplish? Now, the main reason for fasting should be to focus one's attention on God for the purpose of prayer. The way this is supposed to work is every time you get hungry, that should drive you to pray. With that as the overall goal, people in the Bible fasted for a lot of different specific reasons. People fasted to demonstrate repentance from sin. The law of Moses called for all of Israel to fast on what was called the Day of Atonement, as described in Leviticus 16. That was the day when the people would assemble and the priests would offer a special sacrifice for their sins. And Moses says, "This shall be a permanent statute for you. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall humble your souls and not do any work, whether the native or the alien who sojourns among you. For it is on this day that atonement shall be made for you to cleanse you. You will be clean from all your sin before the Lord." According to the book of Jonah, chapter 3, the residents of the city of Nineveh fasted as a show of their repentance in response to the preaching of Jonah. And another example, in Ezra chapter 10, the scribe Ezra fasted over the sins of his people who had returned to Jerusalem from exile in Babylon. Another reason people in the Bible fasted was to express deep sorrow or grief. In 2 Samuel 3, King David fasted to mourn the assassination of his former enemy, General Abner. A little later, in 2 Samuel chapter 12, David fasted during the illness of the child that had resulted from his adulterous affair with Bathsheba. In the Bible, people also fast to seek guidance from God. In Ezra chapter 8, Ezra led the Jewish exiles to fast in order to seek God's protection and guidance before they began their journey back home to Jerusalem. And in the New Testament, in Acts 13, we see the early church fasting before making major decisions and selecting leaders. People also fasted to strive for victory in spiritual struggles. In the book of 2 Chronicles, chapter 20, when the nation of Judah was invaded by foreign enemies, King Jehoshaphat called on his people to fast and to pray to God for protection. According to the book of Esther, chapter 4, when the Jews in Persia were threatened by a genocidal plot, Queen Esther called on her companions to join her in a fast as she prepared to ask the king of Persia for deliverance. In Luke 4, Jesus fasted for 40 days in the wilderness just before launching his public ministry. Fasting is a spiritual discipline that reminds us that some things are more important than physical sustenance. And that's something we all need to be reminded of from time to time. Think about what most of us have experienced at funerals. Why do people who are grieving often need to be reminded to eat? Well, typically, the reason is that they're so focused on their sense of loss that everything else temporarily loses importance. Or have you ever been so busy trying to finish up an important project that you just forgot to take a meal break? Dr. Wesley Duell, the president emeritus of the One Mission Society, has said, fasting in the biblical sense is choosing not to partake of food because your spiritual hunger is so deep, your determination in an intercession is so intense, or your spiritual warfare so demanding that you've temporarily set aside even fleshly needs, to give yourself to prayer and meditation. Now, Jesus assumed that his disciples would fast, even though he never actually commanded us to fast. When Jesus began his comments, he said, whenever you fast. There he's indicating that he anticipated his followers would, at some point, practice fasting. However, Jesus' followers are never given a clear command to fast, either by Jesus nor by any New Testament writer. In fact, the only time Jesus ever commanded his people, or the only time God, rather, ever commanded his people to fast on a regular basis involved the fast that coincided with the Day of Atonement, which we mentioned earlier. It's described in Leviticus chapter 16. Yet, at the time of Jesus, regular fasting had come to be expected as an indication of one's religious devotion. In Jesus' day, observant Jews were expected to participate in several annual fasts that had been added to the calendar over the years to commemorate landmark events in Israel's history. Especially pious individuals like the Pharisees fasted at least twice a week. Here's the thing, though. Individuals who chose not to participate in these fasts often were looked down upon as somehow less spiritual than the religious elites. Of course, those expectations about fasting are a lot more to human religious tradition than they did to God's revealed commands. Now, while fasting can be a beneficial spiritual discipline, it should never be used as a barometer of someone's devotion to God. In fact, fasting should never be about drawing attention from or attention to or sympathy from other people. In Jesus' day, many people who fasted went to great lengths to make sure everybody knew about it. They would neglect their physical appearance. They wouldn't groom themselves. They'd wear disheveled clothes or even put on sackcloth, which is kind of like burlap. Some people would smear ashes all over their faces. They'd walk around with a somber, pitiful look on their faces. They would advertise the fact of their fast at every opportunity, such as when they were invited to meals by other people. Hey, Joe, why don't you come eat with us? Sorry, can't eat today. I'm fasting. Now, the problem with that is not public piety, but it's with a perverted and prideful piety. The real problem is not so much in what these people were doing, but it's in why. Deep down, their true motivation was not to seek God through this practice, but to draw everyone's attention to how devoted they were. Pride is a poison that, left unchecked, can corrupt any positive action. How often do we let our pride and a desire to impress others corrupt our own acts of devotion? When you raise your hands in worship or you go down to the altar to pray, are you really reaching out for God or simply trying to raise your own spiritual profile? Hey, everybody, look how spiritual I am. What does spiritual even look like? Does it mean coming to church wearing uncomfortable clothes? Does it mean pretending to be somber and serious when we're in the church building? Do you talk about God differently than other people and things that you care about? A few years ago, our family went shopping at a department store, and my youngest daughter and I were done. So we went out to the lobby and we sat down on a bench while we waited for the rest of the group to come out. And sitting at another set of benches close by were a group of senior citizens. As we were waiting, I couldn't help but overhear that one of the gentlemen in that group was talking about Jesus. Now, he started off talking about the gospel normally, but as he continued, his voice began to change. He began to get louder and louder. His inflections and his cadence began to change. Now, God forgive me for judging, but as I listened, I couldn't help but thinking to myself, I wonder if he talks like that when he's talking about his favorite football team. Somehow I don't think so. Do we really think that God only hears us when we speak a certain way or use certain words? Or are we really speaking that way for the benefit of maybe a different audience? How often do we refrain from obeying God because we're concerned about how other people are going to perceive us? If we fast or any other spiritual discipline just to get attention from others, then according to Jesus, that attention is the only reward, the only benefit that we can expect. Instead, fasting should draw our attention to God. In contrast to the sackcloth and ashes crowd, Jesus instructed his followers that when they fasted, they should keep their appearance normal. Anointing the head refers to using oil to style one's hair or to improve one's sense. In other words, keep up your normal grooming. Instead of smearing ashes all over your face, Jesus taught his followers to wash their faces like normal people do. We don't need to alter our outward appearance to get God's attention. We only need to alter our hearts. God sees what is done in secret. God knows who we really are behind the clothes, the religious language, the somber faces, and the pious facade that we project for the benefit of others. God sees the real us with all of our failures and our insecurities. So why can't we just stop putting on the show and just be ourselves before the God who truly sees? In all of our worship, the only approval that really matters, after all, is God's. Our word integrity comes from the Latin word integer, meaning whole or complete. Back in the days of classical Rome, statues and sculptures were all the rage. People commissioned sculptures to commemorate all kinds of events. Sometimes the demand outstripped the available material, so unscrupulous sculptors would use inferior blocks of stone for their work. And then they try to fill the gaps with substances like clay. Well, the resulting pieces might look good for a while, but they were hollow, they were less durable, and they wouldn't stand the test of time. So people who were concerned about buying quality pieces would have statues inspected to make sure that they were real marble. And when a sculpture was certified as being made from genuine stone all the way through, it was stamped with the word integer. Is your devotion just for show? Is your worship just a facade that looks pretty on the outside, but it's only covering up the emptiness on the inside? Or does your worship have integrity? Is it solid all the way through, coming from a heart that truly loves God and desires to bring glory to him? If our worship and our behavior is intended simply to impress others, it's going to lack integrity, and it won't stand the test of time. Sooner or later, we're going to be revealed as the charlatans we are. But if our worship comes from a heart that's truly open and honest with God, a heart that's more concerned with being in tune with him than when impressing other people, then our worship will be genuine and real. And it'll leave an imprint in us that'll endure for eternity. Does your worship have integrity today? If you'd like to discuss that question more in depth, feel free to post a comment or reach out to me at pastor@newsalembaptist.net. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it with your friends. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe and sign up for notifications so you'll know when we post our next study. Until then, may you walk with the Lord in honesty and integrity. God bless.